So you can clearly see countries that are rimmed with orange that do not yet have national protections. And this is our roadmap towards species level protection. There are nations without protection. There are nations with some protection but not for all species. For example, at the workshop we learned that India has 4 species of sawfish, but we only have protections for 3 in place at the moment. There are countries with protections for all species, but there's no enforcement at all. And there are countries where there's enforced protection, Australia and the US, but only the US has a recovery plan. Australia is working on a recovery plan right now. And working our way in delivering protections, we hope to achieve our first goal, which is for robust sawfish populations where threats are minimized and or mitigated through national protection. Of course, national species level protection has to go hand in hand with national protection of habitat. Juvenile sawfishes are on average found in 1 meter of water in a strong association with mangroves. And we've lost around 1/3 of the world's mangrove area in the last quarter of a century. We have a second goal, and we realize that we're not going to achieve the first goal without a whole series of actions related to capacity building, research, education, and outreach. And I'm not going to go into much detail on those today. And as part of that communication process, we managed to take all of this work to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Committee on Fisheries in Rome, where we managed to engage national fisheries players and also FAO itself. We also brought it to the scientific community, and we're bringing it to the conservation community here. But we've taken a very helicopter view of conservation planning at the global scale. What we need to do is to downscale to regions and countries. And the brightest light in our portfolio at the moment is a project in West Africa, which is going to focus very strongly on developing capacity building to understand the plight and status and the conservation actions necessary in West Africa. Now, one thing that has been absolutely critical is funding, and moving from red listing, describing status, to conservation planning has enabled us to engage a whole series of new funders in a very exciting way that has been transformative for ourselves as a nascent specialist group. In particular, Save Our Seas Foundation and the US government stepped in at the last minute with an enormous amount of funding, and the Mohammed bin Zayed Foundation. And I think it's at this point where I'd just like to thank you for your attention, and just to let you know, I apologize I have to leave the room, but if you want to learn a bit more about this story, then please talk to Lucy Harrison later. Thank you.
Well, there we have two examples of very different situations. One is a very small country, the other multiple species, the other many species, global distribution, and trying to apply the same approach to planning across all of them. But the problem is that we need to get more taxonomic coverage. We need to get plants planned, see how that works. We need to do some invertebrates or more invertebrates, and we need more situations of exploitation, threat, and so on. But there's also a bigger sort of tension, and that is the conventional planning approach involves having a consultative meeting with all the right stakeholders, and that will vary depending on whether it's a regional meeting or a national level meeting. And very often these are 4 or 5 day meetings of intense creativity and discussion with all the expertise you need on GIS, modeling, and so on. These are hugely expensive, and a meeting like that can often cost $50,000 depending on where it is and who you have to fly in and so on. And so they are resource intensive, and there is clearly a limit to the number of species we can raise that level of funding for. And this is probably a small number in relation to the number of species that actually need planning. So we've got to see if we can streamline the process, can we reduce the costs, and yet get still the same impact and quality. So how can we do this? Well, perhaps many of these workshops have a population viability analysis. Perhaps the basic work of that can be done by the experts before the meeting, and then people can review that and change it instead of starting from scratch. Maybe the threat analysis, we can collect the threats and standardize the threats, because there is a red list of threats. maybe we can just use that. Maybe we can standardize conservation actions. Do you need anti-poaching? Do you need some captive breeding? Do you need more space? But again, that may be a bit too crude, I suspect, at the moment. So these are ways in which we may be able to save a bit of time and effort and cost. The other method is whether we can streamline it completely by using technology. And there's been one very interesting effort here to do some planning work for this small Australian marsupial, the mala. And this was using an internet-based tool to see if it would work. And CBSG has actually done a review of over 60 different web-based applications to see if they are applicable to species planning. And for the Mala workshop, basically there were 9 participants, so it's still fairly small. They were in 3 countries, 4 time zones, and they had 4 sessions, each of only an hour to an hour and a half long, at weekly intervals. So it's quite different from getting everybody together in one room for an intense period. And this was experimental, but it seemed to work extremely well. And the advantages, of course, are reduced cost, not having to fly people around the world, as to a conference like this. Flexible scheduling, you can do it when it suits people. You can bring in more people halfway through if you need special expertise. And also, because they're only having 1 meeting a week, it gives time for the brain to work out things in between while, whether it's doing it knowingly or not. The challenge, of course, is that you lose all the benefits of face-to-face meetings. And if you're asked to take part in a remote conference with somebody you don't know, you probably won't feel as comfortable as if you had even met that person once. So there's clearly a bit of a cost there. And of course it replaces all the normal visual cues of personal interaction. You gauge how neatly how someone is feeling about something you've said by their behavior and so on. But all that may get better. And of course it's the issue of how we can maintain momentum when you're all sitting on your own at home rather than being part of a group which is interacting and so on. So just to conclude, I hope I've shown that species planning really is absolutely essential. There clearly are challenges in making the process widely available, widely known about, and cost effective. And that's something we've really got to work on. But if we can then succeed, then we can add a lot of species plans that are being implemented to the whole SSC knowledge products and the range of them. And I'm going to end now and hand over to Christoph, who's going to talk about a one-plan approach. And this again is maybe one supportive concept for making our planning and species conservation much more effective. Thank you.
So just to remind everyone that we will be having a panel discussion immediately after this. But if there are any questions that you have for either Nick or Mark right now, this would be a good time to have it. Okay. What Mark and Nick have done have given us an overview of species planning, the focus on objectives, and as Nick said, one of the compelling reasons to go through that planning process is both to organize oneself, but also to engage others, particularly donors. This next session will focus on coordinated planning for all populations of a threatened species. The one plan approach, which actually basically tries to pull all of these things together. It focuses very much on Tasmanian devils and has a field approach and a captive approach. CBSG as an entity was very involved in really breaking the first ground with species planning, and you'll see some of the products of that. So, Christoph, yours.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you very much, John. Let's see if I can. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Good. So, I'm going to talk about a one-plan approach. My name is Christoph Schwitzer. I'm from the Bristol Zoological Society in the UK. I'm talking here from the Conservation and Breeding Specialist Group, and the co-author on my introductory talk here is the chair of that specialist group, Ollie Myers, who's sitting near the front, and will also be in the front here in the panel later on. Right, this is not new, this approach. This is not rocket science. It's simply a merger that is long overdue, in our view. Here you can see a couple of photos, a couple of examples of animal populations. You can have animal populations in the wild, in inverted commas. You can have animal populations in zoos and aquariums. And these are two ends of a continuum. With wild, you would normally mean a population that is unmanaged, not managed at all by humans. Obviously, populations in zoos and aquariums are intensively managed. Two ends of a continuum with lots of other things in between. So you can see the Arabian oryx on the top left. I don't know if I have a pointer here, but you can obviously spot which one I mean. And these were extinct in the wild. They're now down listed to vulnerable, which is a great achievement. They went via a period of time in captivity only. They are still intensively managed in captivity, and there are lots now, well, quite a few in the wild again. On the bottom left, you can see a Sumatran rhino in a semi-reserve somewhere in Malaysia, I believe. Top right, African hunting dogs, again, a population that is managed in the wild. So you have a lightly managed population perhaps here, and then this moose on the bottom right is a special case for an intensively managed animal. I don't really know, I just took that from the internet. Well, the case for management of populations in the wild, thank you very much, is becoming greater. So you can see here, this is a picture of Madagascar forest destruction, and this is an ex-rice field again in Madagascar. So lots of habitats around the world are shrinking, and lots of populations are being managed now in one way or the other. And this is a frog having died of chytrid fungus, a disease that many amphibians are suffering from in the wild now. And again, many of these populations are being taken into zoos and aquariums, into intensively managed populations to survive, and then hopefully to be released into the wild again afterwards. Right, and the current approach to species conservation planning is too often consistent of two separate approaches. So in many cases we don't see a lot of integration in species conservation planning. Species conservationists in specialist group or other people doing species conservation planning often do not see the potential contribution from intensively managed populations. Intensively managed populations are often not regarded as all as part of species conservation planning, and are rarely considered as part of wider meta populations. On the other side, planning for intensively managed populations by zoos and aquariums is, in the vast majority of cases, pretty much independent from species conservation planning. Zoos and aquariums do regional collection plans, and then on the institutional scale, institutional collection plans, which link into the red list, but normally are not part of integrated species conservation planning. And then that results in a lot of closed and non-integrated, intensively managed populations that are often not viable over the long term in zoos and aquariums and other institutions. And you can see that here, visualized on a slide. So you have species conservation planning for the wild populations, you have species conservation planning for the captive population, and occasionally there's cross-pollination here. That's a golden lion tamarin, and it works quite nice with the intensively managed population contributing to safeguarding the wild population. That's the usual approach. And our one plan approach philosophy, very simply, is an integrated conservation plan for a species, both inside and outside its natural range, under all conditions of management, engaging all responsible parties and all available resources, and all that from the very start of any species conservation planning initiative. So it's essentially, as I said, it's nothing really new. It has been done very successfully for quite a few species already. It's not rocket science. Mark has mentioned it basically in his talk already, that you need to integrate all stakeholders, but we are re-emphasizing here the role that managed populations can play and ought to play in species conservation planning. And the slide visualizing that is now this one here. You can see all responsible parties, all available resources, our one plan approach, a conservation strategy for the entire meta population, including a definition of the roles of any managed populations or intensively managed populations, leading to a fully conserved species, which is a term that Liz will in her talk about further later on. And now I'm going to show you an example for that. And I'm going to introduce two people who we have pre-recorded. So I'm going to play a DVD. And these two people are Andrew Sharman, who used to work for the Tasmanian government and used to be the program officer for the Tasmanian Devil Recovery Program. So he exclusively worked for the devil, so to speak. And the other person is Caroline Lees, who used to work for the Australasian Zoo Association at the time that this recovery plan was drawn up, and is now a CBSG program officer. And these two will now talk about the recovery of the Tasmanian devil, a species that is suffering from a fatal disease that you will see in a minute. And this example is not really to do with the disease a lot, even though that is very interesting, but it's really trying to show you how to integrate species conservation planning over all available resources and all conditions of management. So try to sort of look at that in particular. So we're going to play the DVD. It's first Andrew, then Caroline, then Andrew again, then Caroline again, and then finally me again. It's only in English, so it's not going to be translated, I'm afraid, because that would be difficult. So hopefully you'll understand it all, and if you have any questions, I'll answer them later. Can you play the video? Thank you.
I'm Andrew Sharman, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about how to save the Tasmanian devil.
Can we switch off the light somehow?
Implement the strategy for identifying the insurance and regulation. The Tasmanian devil, Sarcophilus parasite, is threatened with extinction from the devil facial tumour disease, a transmissible cancer. And this disease was first identified in 1996 by a photographer, Gustav Bartz, who saw this devil with gross lesions around the mouth and head, and provided this photograph to the department. Subsequent to that, a number of other devils were sighted and identified with similar lesions and tumours around the head and face region. By 2000, we'd identified DFTD populations of Tasmanian devil down the east coast of Tasmania. And by 2002, the disease had been identified in the Midlands of Tasmania. Tumour onset with DFTD can be very rapid, as you can see between the photograph on the left and the right. There's a 15 weeks duration of that degree of tumour growth. Advanced DFTD results in gross lesions and tumours around the head and face region. It also often results in secondary cancers. Devils ultimately succumb to a number of causes. These can be starvation or organ failure, as the secondary cancers usually infect lungs, heart and bowel organs. Devil facial tumour disease, as we know it, is a contagious cancer. It's spread through biting and it needs direct contact. Currently, there is no cure, there is no vaccine, and there are no resistant therapies. This disease is fatal in all cases. And in 2012, This is the extent of the devil facial tumour disease. It is now across 70% of Tasmania, and we've seen an 80% reduction in the sightings of Tasmanian devils across the state. It's resulted in a significant reduction in the population, a massive decline that's been measured in long-term statistics agencies 1996. In 2003, the Save the Tasmania Devil program was established. The program has a vision to maintain an enduring and ecologically functioning population of devil in the world. And we do this through a number of measures: maintain genetic diversity of the devil population, to maintain the population in the wild, and to manage the ecological impacts of the reduced Tasmanian population over its natural range. This is the top water carnivore in Tasmania, and it has an influence on the ecosystem around it. The Save the Tasmanian Devil program has three core sub-programs. The insurance population sub-program was established for the maintenance and support of the insurance population. This is one of the first parts of the program that really kicks in. It manages the relationships with partners, and we test and evaluate alternative strategies within the insurance population. That's things like pre-arranging projects and less intensive management projects. The current priorities